all the cases that have not been solved, especially ones like this from all the years ago, advances in forensics, hopefully will get these cases solved and give the family a bit of a peace of mind in the future.
Yeah, it's just closure, isn't it, for a lot of people?
Just a quick disclaimer, the content presented in this podcast is based on real events and may contain graphic descriptions of violence, crime scenes and other disturbing material. Listener discretion is advised. Hi everyone and welcome to episode 2 of the Grave Secrets podcast. We're your hosts, I'm Annie.
And I'm Beth. So today's case, we're going to talk about the disappearance of Patricia Ann Hall.
This is what we both said, isn't it, we want to do as soon as we started the podcast?
Yeah, it is. There is a documentary about it, which is really interesting, but I'm not going to tell people the name of it until the end.
Right.
I don't want them clicking off right now and going
to watch that instead. Listen to us, we're more interested.
Yeah. This case today is open and unsolved.
Yeah.
It's the first case we've covered. Obviously, this is only episode 2. So if we are checking notes, that is because these are real people that we're talking about.
We want to get it right.
Yeah, we don't want to do anyone an injustice.
Yeah.
These are all really important and it's real people, isn't it? So I would rather us get things right.
Yeah, and have a little glance at your notes.
And glance at the notes.
Yeah, rather than try and remember.
Yeah.
And we just want to make sure all the information we're giving you is correct, all the names of people, all the dates, so you can sort of put it into perspective for yourself as well.
Yeah. We've created a bit of a timeline, and I think the way that we're going to talk about it today should hopefully lead you into each development. I think the way that we're breaking it down makes it as understandable as possible.
Yeah.
Just in terms of how we are going to kind of set these episodes out. When we are doing a case study episode, we're going to have one of us that kind of takes the lead and talks through it with the other one.
Yeah.
We've both done just as much research. We've both covered all bases. But I think it just flows a bit easier when it's kind of one person.
And we do seem to work like this at work as well, don't we?
Yeah, we do.
I feel like just randomly one of us will take the lead, the other one will just jump in wherever.
Yeah.
And remember, we are going to be giving you some of our own thoughts and opinions on the cases as well. But we will always tell you that these are our own opinions.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's get into it.
So Patricia Ann Hall.
Patricia Ann Hall, as I've mentioned, this is an unsolved case. It's still an open investigation. It took place in 1992, so it's a few years ago now, but it's still an open investigation. It's not been solved, so we still don't have an answer, but it's a really interesting case in terms of the amount of evidence and then also lack of evidence.
Yeah, and we always talk about in work as well, like the advances in, different forensic...
Yeah, scientific equipment and also scientific progression, really, isn't it?
Yeah, so hopefully all the cases that have not been solved, especially ones like this from all the years ago, advances in forensics, hopefully will get these cases solved and give the family a bit of a peace of mind in the future.
Yeah, it's just closure, isn't it, for a lot of people? Even if it's not what you want to hear, it's just knowing what's happened.
Yeah, definitely.
So Patricia was 39 when she was reported missing. I'll give you a bit of information about Patricia, first of all, because I think that's really important.
Just to start off, this is actually a local case, isn't it? So
yes,
this is one of the local cases we discussed, and we wanted to do this one because it's in Pudsey, which is in Leeds, in Yorkshire, and obviously you can tell from our accents, we are both Yorkshire.
Pretty Yorkshire.
Yes.
So, yes, Pudsey, I mean, I've driven through Pudsey a number of times.
Right.
I had heard of the case, but I didn't realise that it was as local as it is.
Yeah.
So, I think that's important to mention. But Patricia was a local to Pudsey. She'd kind of grown up with quite a strong family unit.
Yep.
She had a sister called Christine who was born 9 years after she was born.
Yeah, she was said on some things that I've read that Patricia was almost a bit like a mother figure to her and her two brothers as well.
Yeah, so it was actually Patricia's mother, well, all of their mother, that became ill, unfortunately, when she was in kind of her late teens.
Right.
So she did take on that kind of caring role.
Yeah.
And also Christine, who we will talk a lot about in this episode, because Christine's played a massive part in trying to raise awareness of the disappearance of her sister. They grew up in the same bedroom.
Yeah.
So they
were
were
very
incredibly
close, weren't they? Yeah.
And I think over the years, as their lives have developed, they did spend an awful lot of time together, and they would kind of debrief and talk about what was going on in their lives.
Yeah, like you do with a sister as well. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So, sharing a bedroom with your sister from a young age, me and my sister are very different, but also incredibly close. And I just can't imagine what it'd be like to even have her disappear for a short amount of time.
Oh, well, mine, she can't disappear for a day.
Yeah.
She can't disappear for a few hours without me saying, where are you? What are you doing? I'm here. I've got something to tell you.
But yes, so the relationship that they had was incredibly close. But then we should also mention Ian and Brian, who were the brothers in the case, as well. So Patricia had a relatively settled home life, again, from the information that we've got. And she actually met her soon-to-be husband, Keith Hall, quite early on. She was in her early 20s, and she was actually having, I think he was there as an electrician in the house.
Yeah, she was actually having the something to do with the plumbing done. She was having something plumbed in, and he needed an electrician to help out.
Yeah.
And it was actually Keith's friend,
Yeah,
so he
it
rang
was
Keith.
One of his mates who said, would you mind giving me a hand on this job? And effectively that is where Keith then met Patricia.
Yeah.
Keith has said himself that he was instantly attracted to Patricia because she had a friendly face and she had lovely features, I think was the quote that he used.
A lot of people throughout this have commented on Patricia having such that like good, friendly personality, always bubbly, very outgoing.
Just a kind of warm nature. And I think they have said that she was quite a valuable member of the community in terms of like everyone kind of knew her face.
Yeah, all the neighbours got on with her. Yeah, everyone knew who she was.
Have an image of someone like that in your head, I think, don't you? Someone that you just kind of know from round and about.
Yeah.
And she was actually an Avon lady. So she worked selling Avon. So apparently she would go and knock on the neighbours' houses and see if they needed any orders.
Yeah, if we've got any really young listeners that are listening to this, we'll just explain what an actual Avon lady is. Because I bet some of them are like, I have no idea.
I don't think twice.
So,
but right.
An Avon lady would go door to door selling Avon makeup, and there was always an Avon lady in the neighbourhood. So we didn't have one at my mum and dad's house because they live quite far out of the way, but whenever I went to my grand's house, I always remember someone coming around with an Avon catalogue.
Yes, the catalogue.
And you'd have a look through it and see if there's anything you want to choose, and then they'd come back round again a bit later, and then you'd put your order in.
To be fair, they still do it with the Body Shop and stuff now,
do
don't
they?
Yeah.
They still come round to your house?
Well, they do, only if I ask them to. But you still go through the brochure and things like that.
Yeah. So any of our young listeners, that's what an Avon lady is.
There's
it's like the original MLM, isn't it, really?
So Patricia was incredibly friendly, had a lot of friends. But if we go back to that first encounter that Keith actually met Patricia, he said that he instantly knew he wanted to ask her out on a date. And actually, with the money from that job that he worked at her house, then took her out for dinner.
Yeah, she paid him £10 and he used the money. So technically, she paid for her own first date.
Her own first date. But they got on really well. And it was actually within a year that they'd got married, which to me sounds crazy. But I think at that time, especially... kind of our older generations, that is just what
I was just going to say the generations are different. You know, we don't really do that now. But if you look at our parents or grandparents, it would probably have been like that. And I think Keith came across as being a little bit more of sort of the quieter one.
Yes, definitely.
And sort of the opposite to Patricia in a way. But I feel like opposites attract. And maybe she managed to bring out something in him that, sort of brought out a bit more of his...
Definitely.
His personality.
And I think one thing that they had both made clear is that they wanted children.
Yes.
So it was pretty quickly that they then had children. They had 2 boys. Unfortunately, with Patricia's first child, Andrew, she did get quite severe postnatal depression.
Yeah.
And postnatal depression comes in various forms, and some people suffer from it a lot more severely than others. But Patricia did end up needing to enter a facility for a while. I think it was a few weeks that she was in there.
That will have been quite tough on the family, and maybe took quite a toll on Keith as well at that point.
Yes.
Imagine having, you know, sort of like your new relationship, you're newly married, and then you've all of a sudden got a new baby, which will be overwhelming.
Yeah.
And then, you know, your wife's also...
Yeah, I'm not sure, because I know a lot of facilities do things differently now, whether or not Patricia had Andrew with her at the facility, or whether effectively for that period of time Keith was a single dad, because that must be quite daunting as well.
Yeah.
To just be kind of left, for any parent, if you're left on your own in that situation, it would be really daunting.
Yeah.
So I think that, yes, that did put a definite strain on their relationship.
Quite early on as well.
Quite early on. It's very intense to happen straight away.
Yeah.
But they went on to have a second child, Graham, and Graham was a happy child. I remember that Christine, the sister, so the children's auntie, said that there would always be music on in the house, that Patricia absolutely loved music no matter what she was doing.
When she was cleaning, when she was like washing the pots, there'd always be something going on, wouldn't there? Yeah.
So I think the kids, again, from the information that we have, sounded like they had a pretty solid foundation as they were growing up. However, as the years progressed, there did then become a lot more tension in the marriage, which I think we're going to come on to.
Yeah.
Because initially it appeared that everything was fine and dandy and that they'd got the perfect home life.
I suppose you never know what's going on behind closed doors, and it's like that.
Well, exactly.
Even nowadays with stuff, you know, people might, on the outside, you might look at people and think, oh my God, they've got such a perfect relationship.
Yeah.
But you don't actually know what goes on behind the scenes.
No, definitely not. And I think it could just be something like work stress for a couple that puts a lot of tension on something.
Yep.
And so we don't always know what's going on. And yes, it might only be for a short period of time, but it might be a longer period of time. And I know that having worked with kids, they pick up on a lot more than you think,
yes,
especially from an early age.
Yeah.
So even if there is a sign of an argument or there is tension, kids do pick up on that and they will feel it.
Yeah.
So I think that Patricia was quite aware of this as well, and she struggled with the kids being in the house if her and Keith were having an argument.
Yeah.
So we are going to get to the date of the disappearance in a second, but there are a few different incidents which I think provide some context.
Yeah.
And potentially, not reasoning, but a bit more of an insight into how their relationship was in the lead up. So it's the 27th of January 1992 that Patricia was actually reported missing. She was reported missing by her husband Keith, but there were a couple of instances prior to that which effectively were a bit of a red flag.
Oh yeah, they were definitely a cause for concern, weren't they, in the lead up, yeah.
So if we go back to the October of the year before, so that's 1991, Patricia actually confided in a couple of her friends and confided in her sister that the arguing and the tension within the house was getting a lot more extreme, and actually rang them and said that Keith had taken it too far, and he had actually, for the first time, she claims, laid hands on him.
Yeah, the first time it's actually got physical.
Yes.
But I remember one of them, I think it might have been Christine, saying that when Patricia was describing it to her, she said he'd gone too far, but she also said she thought he wasn't going to stop.
Yes. And I know that there's a quote that apparently Patricia had said that there was a darkness behind his eyes.
Yeah.
And
and that must have been so scary for Patricia as well in that situation, knowing that you've got the kids maybe in the house, the kids could have heard it, and that's going to have even more of an impact on your entire family.
And I think just if we bring it back to being in a relationship with someone, feeling like you know them so well enough to marry them, well enough to have 2 children with them, and then you picture seeing them in a way that you've never seen before, that must be so daunting and jarring that you probably aren't going to know how to react in that moment. So I think for Patricia, who's quite a social person, debriefing almost and telling her sister and her close friends about what had happened was also a way of processing it for herself.
I think that was the best thing she could have done by making it aware to other people what was going on. Because a lot of people who do suffer with domestic violence, they do tend to keep it hidden away from other people.
Yeah.
So for her to be so open about it, and she states, doesn't she, straight away, I don't want to be with him, I want to leave him. So I feel like expressing that to someone else, not just would help Patricia, but it gives other people an insight as to what's going on, if there is any danger. Because when a woman or anyone who's suffering from domestic violence, when they say they are leaving, that is the worst time and the most dangerous time for that person.
Yeah. I think a lot of when I talk to people about this kind of scenario, they don't quite understand the amount of bravery but also effort that it takes. And I think even just to open up to your friends, like you say, a lot of people hide it. I know I've been in situations before where I've consciously not been honest because I know how people will perceive it, or ultimately you don't want them to
think bad of the person either, do you? Because if you're not going to leave and you do want to stay with the person,
if you're not ready,
your friends, are all going to say, oh, you need to leave him, they've got your best interests at heart. So I just think it is really brave of her to say this straight up to her friends and to her sister.
And it was at that point that she decided that she wanted a divorce and she was going to leave Keith. And the next instance that we talk about is a week before. It was actually the Sunday before she went missing. And she'd made inquiries with a caravan park in Scotland as to whether or not they had any availability for her and her 2 sons to go up and stay. Now, I don't know how long that was for, but obviously she was intending to go without Keith. Keith, as far as we know, wasn't aware that she had contacted them.
So maybe that was sort of her way out of the relationship, and that's where she was going to be until, the divorce started, just to make sure that she and the kids were safe.
Yeah, and it definitely suggests that there was intent there. And not only had she talked about it, which is really brave, but she was actually taking steps to get herself and her boys out of that situation. So then we come to the Tuesday before the disappearance. As I said, Christine, Patricia's sister, used to meet her sister Patricia quite regularly. They used to have a catch-up. And unfortunately, on this occasion, Christine couldn't make their meeting. So like she would do generally, she gave her a ring, couldn't get through on the mobile, didn't quite understand why, tried a couple of times, wasn't going through. So then actually called Patricia's home to speak to her. It was Keith that answered the phone, and at that point Keith said that they'd had another argument and that Patricia had left and that no doubt she would either be in touch or she'd be back home at some point soon.
But for Patricia to talk to her friends and her family about something so sensitive as to what Keith had put her through beforehand, and then for her not to tell them that maybe she's leaving or she's planning to leave, or I'm not going to be around for a few days, or I have gone to this caravan, or can I come and stay with you? The first person I would ring in a situation is my sister and say, can I come and stay with you? I'm in a situation.
Yeah, and Christine had said as well that it seems very unlikely that Patricia would just disappear.
Without the boys as well.
Without the boys, and also she probably would have gone and stayed at her sister's. And I don't think if she had have done that for a couple of nights at that point that Keith would have argued. But who are we to say? So then we come to the Sunday. It was the Sunday the 27th, and this is when Keith effectively this case begins.
Yeah.
Because Keith reported his wife, Patricia, missing. But it all kind of started on the Monday in terms of informing them. But actually what had happened, which had led to the disappearance, all occurred on that Sunday night, really, didn't it?
Yeah, like the early hours, wasn't it?
So what I'm going to tell you now is from the perspective of Keith. This is what he initially told the police. He says that he had contacted, again, family, friends of Patricia, and when they also had no idea where she was, that's when he decided to report her as being missing.
When he first reported, I didn't think he came across as that concerned at that moment in time. I don't know if it's because it was quite early on, and he thought maybe she was somewhere else or somewhere that he didn't know.
He did say that initially he wasn't overly concerned because apparently she would, if she did get overwhelmed and if they did have an argument, sometimes she would take herself out of the situation.
Yeah.
So he did say that initially he wasn't overly concerned.
He thought she'd done the same as what she'd done before, basically, and he didn't worry too much about that.
Yeah. But if we talk about the Sunday night, the way that Keith portrays the situation is that Patricia had actually confronted him about the fact that she wanted a divorce. They'd had another argument, which again were quite frequent at this time, but she'd actually said that she was going to leave and she was going to take the boys.
I think she'd actually started putting things into play as well. I know that she'd spoke to the divorce lawyer already, and that she was quite open with Keith about this, and she'd said, you know, this is what I want, and this is what I'm doing.
Brave to,
it is.
To go out
a lot of
say,
people sort of hide it right until the last minute, but she seems to have been quite open and upfront in what she wanted from the situation.
She was 39 at the time she disappeared, so I think you do gain a bit more confidence with age. And obviously the boys were a little older by then. But as I say, to actually come out and talk to your husband about something like that must be really daunting. So Keith says that obviously they'd had an argument and that he decided it was for the best if he slept downstairs on the sofa, like a lot of couples do.
I was going to say, there's nothing that up to now, there's nothing that seems suspicious. You'd easily go into a different bedroom, or you don't want to be in, you know, you want to blow off some steam, you want to calm down yourself and go and sleep in a different room. I think for a lot of people that is probably a normal thing to do.
Yeah, probably a good
like
way
a healthy relationship.
Dealing with it. So he claims that he went downstairs, slept on the sofa, but halfway through the night, he felt cold and went upstairs and got in bed with Patricia. I'm not sure how much time then lapsed, but he said it's about 1 o'clock in the morning, and all of a sudden he wakes up and Patricia's getting out of the bed, and she then, next thing he knows, has gone downstairs and is actually on the driveway getting into the family car. They'd got one car. And she actually got into the car and drove off at quite a high speed down the road.
Which would suggest that she's quite annoyed at something to sort of get up, get dressed, storm out of the house at that time in the morning. Yeah. It's quite cold as well, I'm guessing, in January.
Yeah, definitely.
It's not exactly the warmest
here.
outside.
No.
So for her to just up and disappear, she must have been really annoyed with him.
But then also seems strange, because if you've had an argument, then fair enough. But it seems unlikely that you would wake up with him in bed with you and then just decide to leave the house. Either I would go off in a huff and get on the sofa myself if I wanted some distance. I know some friends would have woken him up
and said, you get off.
And argued again with him. But it seems odd that she would just wake up and then decide she needed to go.
Yeah, the logical thing would be when Keith got in bed, she then realised he was in bed and thought, I don't want to talk to him and I don't want to be in the same bed as him. And that's when she's sort of gone in the huff. I don't think as much time maybe has elapsed in between him getting in bed and her getting out of bed. Just like you said, you wouldn't really wait, would you?
No.
It's one way or the other.
And also if you're waking up and then deciding to leave the house, where are you going to go? Are you going to drive around for a bit? Are you going to go to your sister's house? But then you'd have probably texted her to say, Are you
coming
awake?
over. Yeah, it's early hours of the morning.
So
and
there's a lot to consider there, I think.
Keith did actually say, I thought she maybe had gone for a drive to blow off some steam, which I know people do as well.
Yeah. So he kind of went back to sleep after that. Again, like you say, assumed that she'd be back in a couple of hours maybe after she'd had gone for a drive. And it was in the morning that he then actually thought, hang on a minute, she's not come home.
I think when he would have got up and he said he went straight to the window, looked out for the family car and the car's not on the drive, then you might think, oh, she's not come back.
The realisation.
There's something a little bit more serious at this point, because, the kids are still in the house. She would have come back, maybe, take the kids to school, take the kids to work, whatever.
Because it was the end of January, so by that point, kids would have been back at school. They'd have been in a routine.
Yeah.
And again, she, from everything that we know, was a really responsible and good mother. So it would be unlikely that she would just decide to not turn up for her commitments at home.
And leave the kids behind.
And leave them behind.
Yeah.
So what we'll do now is talk through the initial investigation and the initial conversations that Keith had with the police, because it is fact that one of the first people that often gets looked at when we're looking at a case of a missing person, when we're looking at a murder, any type of serious crime.
Anything suspicious.
Unfortunately, it does tend to be those closest to you that have either the most motive or the most reason.
Yeah.
Therefore, it was a natural line of inquiry to speak to Keith to get as much information as possible as to how their relationship was and what had actually led to this disappearance.
And they need to have a look into the background, don't they? They need to see for themselves what sort of a relationship this was, as to find out what could have happened to Patricia in this situation.
So in a missing persons case, you have a suspect team, if you have a suspect. At this point, it might just be someone that's on the Keith team, effectively, in terms of they're gaining as much information about Keith as possible. And then you have a victim team. So you will have a whole team of people just trying to gather as much information about Patricia as possible.
Yeah.
That might be speaking to her hairdresser about what's been going on in her life. It's speaking to as many people as possible that can give us an indication of their life.
Yeah.
Now, initially, when Keith was questioned by the police, again, he portrayed their relationship as being quite
idyllic,
rosy and idyllic.
He did. Yeah, I noticed that.
And that there weren't an awful lot of difficulties in the relationship. But I think the police quickly then realised that this wasn't necessarily the case.
I think that was all down to Patricia's sister, Christine, again.
Yes.
Who brought up some of these issues, didn't she?
So Christine did mention, which I think is important to state, that when we talked about in the October of the year before, the incident when Keith had strangled Patricia, he stated that she was effectively making up stories.
Yes.
And that wasn't the case. Christine stated that Patricia had actually said, if anything happens to me, please look after my boys.
That doesn't sound like a woman who's making something up. And her friend also said that on the phone, when she told her about it, it was just after he'd strangled her.
Yeah.
And she was still coughing.
Yeah,
she was coughing. She was a bit out of breath. She sounded like she'd just been through something.
Yeah.
And that was obviously out of character for Patricia to sound like that as well. So I think for him to just say, oh yeah, she's lying.
And everything, everything was rosy.
Everything's fine.
I know, as we mentioned, so if you've got a missing person, you will also have a house-to-house search team. Again, all of these different teams are separate.
Yeah.
Everyone has their own role. But there were investigators that were going out into the local area and again gaining as much information as possible.
I think on this one there was over 40 police officers to start with at the Pudsey incident room.
Yeah.
So that is a really big team of people.
Yeah, it is a big team.
To go out. But I know the house to house brought up quite a few.
It did, which is what I was just about to mention actually, because a couple of the neighbours had again brought to light that this relationship wasn't rosy, because they'd actually heard raised voices, they'd heard shouting, they'd heard arguing, and on that night, on the Sunday night, they had heard raised voices and arguing, slamming of doors, all about 10:30 at night. And then they actually hadn't heard an awful lot then up until 1 a.m. And as Keith said, at about 1 a.m, they then heard a car slamming the door shut, revving the engine and going at high speed up the road.
Yeah, the neighbours also said that they'd heard the arguing up until a certain point.
Yes.
And then all of a sudden,
Nothing.
It had stopped. Nothing at all. And to me, you know, if you're going to argue with someone, I know you could go into separate rooms, you could slam the doors and you could both go and cool down. That's the end of the argument. But for something just to stop that suddenly and all the noise in the house to then stop, like no more slamming doors, no more anything.
Yeah.
Deadly silence after that point, to me, is quite...
It seems off or abrupt. You would think that there'd be more of a cool down period.
Yeah. And you know what, like your neighbours, I've lived in houses before where you've been in quite close proximity to your neighbours, and you do hear quite a lot of things.
You do,
and you
often
hear the arguing,
and you often get to know them. You know what's kind of familiar, even if you don't know them well to speak to, or you wouldn't go out for a drink with them. You quite often know their habits.
Yeah,
and so I think that the fact that they thought it was significant enough to mention would maybe suggest that that was out of the ordinary.
Yeah. But then I also think on the other hand as well, if I'm going to play like devil's advocate and twist it round, if the neighbours had heard all this arguing and they'd heard quite clearly doors slamming, would Patricia have gone down quietly if he would have done something to her there? Without the neighbours hearing that?
Yeah.
I sort of feel like from what we know about Patricia, she's quite... I think she'd be a fighter in that situation.
Yeah.
I think she would
but
do
then
what
again,
she could.
Even if you tried, if you are being strangled, potentially, can you make an awful lot of noise?
Yeah.
I think you just never know, do you?
Yeah.
So the neighbours had noted that there was this kind of disturbance, but one key thing was that the neighbour that had heard the car going down the road didn't actually see. He said he got to the window, but he got to the window too late.
Right.
And he couldn't actually see who it was that was in the car.
Yeah.
So yes, Keith says that it was Patricia in the car, but do we actually have any evidence to back that up? As far as we're aware, there isn't actually that evidence.
It's just Keith's word that we've got for things at this moment in time, isn't it?
Yeah. So as the investigation progresses, the family car was actually then found by Woodall Lake, I believe it was.
Yes.
And it was found abandoned. But again, there was another witness that came forward that said, again, around 1 o'clock in the morning, between 1 and 2, something odd had happened. They'd seen a car pull up by some fence railings. They'd seen someone get out of the car, jump over the fence railings, go into the fields nearby, come back, and then either put something into the car or took something out of the car. They weren't quite sure as to what it was, but effectively then abandoned the car.
And they said as well that they said a person. There was nothing to say it was a female that had got out and got over the fence. There's nothing to say that was Patricia.
Yes.
And they couldn't tell, obviously, if it was Keith either. So we're still sort of, even though
very unsure.
Even though someone's seen something,
yes,
we're still quite unsure of the whole situation as a whole.
Definitely. And again, it raises the question if Patricia's intention or plan is to escape, and maybe she decided to escape without the boys and was planning for them to join her at a later date.
Yeah.
In my opinion, I'd want a car. I would want some mode of transport.
Yeah.
So it seems odd that she would, if it was her that was the person that was seen, to just abandon her own vehicle.
Yeah.
Why would she have done
and
that?
if you were going to take the vehicle and it's in the middle of the night, she probably could have got the boys out of the house.
Yeah.
And put them in the car and gone that way if that's the way she wanted to sort of escape.
So again, the police obviously investigated this. They investigated the car. As far as I know, there wasn't any kind of key evidence that they found in the car. There wasn't any bags or like suitcases, for example, that she'd put together. There was none of that. But this lake area, I think it was Detective Sergeant Fletcher, Steve Fletcher, I think it was, had mentioned that the lake would be a good place to hide a body or to dump a body.
And
if that's something
what
that you were
fits
going to
in
do.
with that as well, Christine, Patricia's sister, had said that she would try anything at this point to try and get information about Patricia. And she actually went to go and see a clairvoyant.
Yes.
And the clairvoyant
Mentioned
spoke to her
water.
about water.
Yeah.
So I feel at this point, Christine might be thinking, the car's near a lake.
Yeah.
The police are probably going to search the lake.
You're trying to pick any thread, effectively, aren't you?
Yeah.
Any potential lead, any potential information.
You want it followed, don't you? Yeah.
You're trying to. So they analysed the area. They did all of the necessary searches, but came to a stumbling block, effectively. They didn't find anything else at that time. Again, I think when being questioned, Keith was quite matter of fact, as you say about this. You know, the thought of finding an abandoned car, you would potentially think that Keith would get quite
a bit more worried
about.
Yeah.
Because, you know, he's gone from thinking that his wife has just gone out for a drive for a couple of hours. Well, now she's not come back in a couple of hours and she's definitely not in her own vehicle.
Yeah.
So you would expect him to have now
a bit more worry.
Raised concerns.
And as well, just to put into perspective, like the search area that we're talking about, Pudsey and Leeds is got quite rural areas and a lot of woodland. So the searches by the police were actually huge, weren't they? Covering a lot of the woodland nearby the lake. So we are in like a very countryside area. Yeah. And the police said, didn't they, in the case, that there was probably a lot of places around that the body could have been if
she was in fact.
Yeah.
Another thing to note was that by day 18 of the search, they'd actually sent a helicopter up because, as you say, there were a lot of, enclosed, like woodland areas where it would be more difficult to search. So they actually sent a helicopter up to try and get any information that they could.
Yeah, because I think they'd sort of exhausted their options with like the search team on the ground.
Yes.
I know they'd had the sniffer dogs out as well, looking, see if the sniffer dogs could pick up on a scent. So obviously the next stage would be the aerial.
Yeah.
So they did sort of cover all angles, didn't they, on this investigation?
And again, you know, they've obviously re-interviewed Christine at this point.
Yeah.
And she was just adamant that despite everything that was going on with her and Keith, she wouldn't have committed suicide.
Yeah.
You can never say for certain, obviously. You never know quite what anyone is thinking internally or what someone's going through. But she's just convinced to this day that A, she wouldn't have left the boys and escaped and run off on her own. And B, that she wouldn't have taken her own life because it would have meant leaving the boys behind.
Yeah. And I feel like your sister's the person who knows you best as well. So for a sister to say that, I feel like, you know, someone who knows you that well.
Yeah, if there was anyone that would have an inkling,
she would be
her. And especially in this case, Patricia and Christine, we know were close and that she did confide in her.
Yeah.
So if there was going to be any thoughts of suicide, potentially they would have been raised.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to skip now to the 9th of February. So she went missing at the end of January, and now we're at the 9th of February. As we've mentioned, a lot of searches have been taking place, but we've effectively not got any leads.
I feel like a lot's gone on in between that short space of time.
It definitely has, yeah. And the police, as you've mentioned, there were a lot of people working on this case, and they just kind of weren't getting anywhere.
Yeah.
So we get to Sunday, 9th of February, and Keith recalls having a loud knock on his front door, at which point he was actually arrested on suspicion of murder. The police wanted to interrogate Keith. they'd got all of this information from other sources to suggest that he'd potentially lied about the relationship and that things weren't as rosy as he'd portrayed. So they needed to get as much genuine information as they could from him.
And also he's already been a little bit deceitful, hasn't he, by doing that?
Yeah.
So I think that will get the police's suspicions raised anyway.
Yeah. They have said as well that they kind of wanted to get a feel for him as a person. They wanted to understand him. And I think what I'm about to tell you perfectly kind of summarises the oddities in the case, especially when it comes to Keith. So as soon as Keith got into the police car, he states that the officers were threatening him and that they were basically telling him he would never see the light of day and that he was going to be in prison for murdering his wife for an awful long time. Now, I know we can't always rely on every officer to do a good job.
Yeah.
However, the chances of him being confronted in that way from the off is very unlikely.
They'd probably, if anything, be confronting him in the police station when he's under caution,
and
rather than...
obviously police officers and detectives are trained to never treat anyone. You're not going to get information out of a person if you are confronting them from the off.
And they don't actually want him to say anything in the car because they need to caution him first. They need to do everything in the police station. So they wouldn't really want him to say or admit anything in that car anyway, would they? Thinking about it logically.
So these are all Keith's claims, but he said that the way he was treated from the offset by the police was confrontational, effectively, which then led, as soon as he got into the police station and was interviewed, then led him to say, I exercise my right to remain silent. Yeah, so not the no comment, which is what we usually hear.
He said it, and it was like those words were the answer to everything. So it wasn't like no comment, I stand by my right to remain silent. But it was every time, and it was almost, the way I see it, rehearsed. Like, even then, I couldn't remember the exact phrasing. Yeah. But it seemed like he knew the exact phrasing from the off. And another thing that I thought at this stage sounded a bit suspicious is the police said to him, obviously, do you want to call
this is what I was going to
your
mention.
solicitor? And he said, oh, just on the off chance.
He said, by a stroke of luck.
Yes.
I have a solicitor's name in my back pocket on a piece of card. Yeah. And so he then rang a solicitor straight away. And the solicitor...
That was Rodney Lester. He had a very good reputation as a criminal defence lawyer. But just for him to randomly, on his way to the police station...
It's not a stroke of luck, is it?
Just have that card in his pocket. I think that card was placed in his pocket way before and he knew what was coming.
On a Sunday morning, you've not just got something like that in your back pocket.
Yeah, and for someone who's not a criminal. It's not like he's... As Rodney Lester said in the...
he'd never been arrested.
He'd never been arrested before. He didn't have a criminal history. This wasn't like a career criminal that would constantly need the number in his pocket. Because
you do have some criminals that, like, know
the number off by heart.
Yeah, they know the person that's booking them in. They know everyone.
Yeah. So I think that is a bit strange in itself for him to just pull out the card. And I think Keith said that the police were expecting him to go for the duty solicitor, which is who the police would give you. Yeah. And he said he thought they were quite shocked when he pulled out Rodney Lester's phone number.
Yeah. Again, odd that, like, of all the phone numbers, it's not just like a random guy that you've seen in the newspaper. It's a really good at what he does.
Criminal defence. Yeah.
So again, there's a couple of things there that we could potentially pick up on as being odd. But Keith was interviewed for hours and he did use his right to remain silent and didn't say a word. Which again, if it's the disappearance, we need to go back to the fact that this is
his wife. Yeah.
Patricia is missing and has been missing for a month now. Yeah. And he doesn't seem to want to help them gain any information.
So if you put yourself in that situation, if your partner went missing and you got brought in, I would sit there and I would be telling them everything I knew about him, who his friends are, where he works, when was the last time he was seen, what he was wearing on
this
that
thing
day.
he mentioned once that might be irrelevant.
He said he might visit such and such place, in a passing conversation. I would be writing it down in the meantime of the police coming to my house. I would be in the police station saying, this has happened, this is what I remember. Like, I would be giving all that information
as much as possible
because I would want to find him. Yeah.
But no. But apparently, according to Keith, the reason that he wasn't helpful was purely down to how the police had treated him.
But if the police had treated me badly in the car, had said a few things to me,
in the grand scheme of things,
I would think I still want to find my partner. So I would still help in the investigation. Like, I'm not. No. I wouldn't really be that bothered about how they treated me. I'd want to help.
But that's his justification. So in the end,
again.
On this occasion, they had to let him go and effectively didn't find anything out, didn't gain any information from that interaction with Keith. A couple of the officers have said that he did appear quite smug, maybe. And just was quite abrasive from the off with the police. And they could tell that it was almost as if he wanted to have that conflict.
And I think the only time that they managed to even get a slight reaction out of him was when they said about his children,
about the boys,
and said, your children have the mom's disappeared, what if you go to prison,
don't
like,
you want
what
us
will happen, do you not want us to find out? And that was the point where he said, right, I need to talk to my solicitor.
That's a really good point.
And they had a little
actually.
break, didn't they?
They had a break, and the police thought, okay, we've cracked him. And we might get even some information now as to what might have happened. But actually that wasn't the case at all. They had this interval in proceedings and the police are getting excited about potentially getting information to help Patricia, and then they go back into the room and yet again,
I stand by my right to remain silent again.
No information given.
Nothing.
So, unfortunately, the case is effectively becoming colder by the minute at this stage. It's been a month, and obviously we know that with missing person cases, that chunk of time at the beginning when they are reported missing is so valuable, and that's when you want the leads to be coming in thick and fast. But that lead didn't come until after this interrogation of Keith. And it was actually an engineering firm that realised that where the car had been found near Woodall Lake, there'd actually been a big roundabout that had been dug up. Not sure why, but it had been dug up.
As far as I know, they were doing some pipe work on the underground.
So it was dug up and had been at the time she'd gone missing. And they thought, oh, wait a minute, even though we've dug it back over, is that a worthy lead? And so it was great that this industrial construction company went forward and said, just an FYI, but is this significant? And the police officers, I think, joked, from what I know, about saying, like, well, how do you expect me to dig up a whole roundabout?
Shall I dig up a roundabout or something, wasn't it?
Shall I get my spade from Asda and go dig up the roundabout? But actually, they needed to, because if Patricia's body, again, if we are looking for a body, if her body had been put under that ground while it was already dug up, then we need to find her. So they did, in fact, dig up that whole roundabout. And it was actually the goodwill of I think it was like a digger company, that they had effectively said, if we get this televised and on the local news,
very
and we
good
give
promotion
you,
for us,
we get you a little bit of press,
Yeah.
would you mind digging up all of this land? At which point they said yes, and in fact the local press did attend.
So the creepy thing is that Keith, he was there,
just on the edge of what was going on. Now, you might think, again, concerned husband, he's waiting to see if they discover Patricia, but he was quite happy to give TV interviews. People were asking him directly whether or not he'd killed Patricia.
Did you not think his answers were a little bit out of the ordinary, because what I remember is he was sort of like, he would do a laugh in between, and I know people have a nervous laugh,
Yeah.
but if someone's talking to you about killing someone, have you killed your
Especially-
wife?
yeah.
You probably wouldn't do like the laugh that he did. I thought it was a little bit...
It does seem really jarring. And again, you can look for yourself on YouTube, things
find
like
the
this.
clip.
But yeah, they did just seem really odd. And there is actually a photograph of him, and he's smiling directly at the camera, quite wryly.
Yeah. Again, a bit cocky, I found, from the way he was talking, the things he was saying. I thought he did come across a little bit cocky. And he did a lot more TV interviews as well.
Yes, and the detectives believe that his presence there was more of a "you'll never find her" kind of...
Again, cocky.
Like psychological, rather than a being there out of concern.
Yeah.
Okay, so again, this story kind of, the case works in parts, and I think the next part that we should mention is quite a bit further down the line. Nothing was found at the roundabout. They dug up the roundabout. They didn't find the remains of Patricia. And again, they were then left just waiting, really, trying to find information. So the next thing that I think we should talk about is, as I say, months later, but someone actually, a woman, entered the police station at Pudsey and said, "I have here the details of Keith, who is suspected in his wife's disappearance. He's effectively put out a Lonely Hearts Looking for Love advert, and I've got in touch with him and I've developed this, not relationship, but I've made that first connection."
Yeah.
And said to the police, "I thought you might like to know."
So the Lonely Hearts ad was usually in a newspaper, and it's where people would say if they're looking for a male or female, what sort of person they wanted, and then they'd leave a maybe contact number or something where you could reply to them.
So I think they'd had an initial message in which Keith had said, "You'll know me from the telly."
Yeah, I was suspected in my wife's disappearance, didn't I? Yeah.
Why would
he
that
openly
be?
said that.
Yeah, but why would that be something you almost seem proud of? Why would... It just seems odd to me that in like one of the first conversations you would have with someone, a complete stranger, that you're trying to impress, you would say, "You'll know me from the telly," not something really traumatic has happened to me. My wife is missing.
Yeah, surely that would send warning bells to the woman as well, because if...
Well, I think it must have done, because she then took
went
it to the
police station. Yeah.
So she takes this to the police, and the police then realise that they've actually been given a kind of golden opportunity, and that what they can now do is reply to Keith and try and engage him in conversation. But actually, rather than this woman respond, it would be an undercover officer.
Yeah, so then they had the task of finding a female police officer who was willing to go undercover.
Yeah.
And I think it was Jim Bancroft who was the lead investigator on this case.
Yeah.
And he sort of created the Liz persona.
Persona. Yes. So the character Liz was then created. We're going to just call her Liz for the sake of telling you about it, just because it makes it a lot easier. But effectively, Liz was an undercover officer that helped this investigation go on.
And it's quite brave of her to do this as well under the circumstances.
So it started off initially with just a couple of phone calls with Keith. And again, he was quite willing to talk about this relationship that he'd got with the police that was like, he called it a psychological battle. But it was also quite keen to talk about the fact that he'd been on the telly. And from a phone call, I would imagine that if you're undercover being a detective, it wouldn't be too daunting.
Yeah.
But what then happened is that Liz actually met Keith in a local pub.
I think over the period of about 4 or 5 months, they met up sort of every month or so, didn't they? And then they had the phone calls in between, and I think there was a few letters as well there as well.
Keith said that whenever they met in person, Liz would always pick him up further down the road.
Yeah.
So that it didn't, again, odd, it didn't alert suspicion to the neighbours. Like, yes, they might have thought that he was moving on quickly, but it just seems like everything he does is quite calculated.
Yeah,
somehow.
It was very calculated. Because, I mean, it was 6 months on, which in real time, if someone's not gone missing...
But no one would have known who she was. She could have been a journalist or something.
Yeah.
So they met, and within that first conversation that they had... Keith himself has admitted that he falls quite easily in love. Obviously, he married Patricia within the year of the meeting, and says that he quickly fell for Liz and that they developed this relationship quite quickly. He was keen to share with her a life. It was then through these meets that I think there was a toll that was taken on, well, there was definitely a toll that was taken on Liz, the undercover officer, and she wasn't sure how much she could deal with it, especially because Keith, again, maybe in a calculated way, had actually called Liz out in one of the conversations at the pub.
Oh, that he was. When I was reading this, I thought he's definitely onto them.
Yeah. And he called out in the pub and said, like, oh, it was funny actually, Liz, because you can hear the tape recordings. It's funny actually, Liz, because your letter came quite quickly after I'd had an interview with the police. So it's almost as if you're a setup and that you're undercover for the police. And she did amazingly well.
I was going to say Liz was so good in these circumstances, because if she'd have let on anything, she would have been in quite a lot of danger as well at this point.
So there was obviously the detective sergeant outside in the car, and they'd got kind of
a minder as well.
A minder, and they were listening to everything through a listening device in her handbag. So they'd got like a live feed of what was going on, and they were kind of ready to step in at that point. But thankfully, she kind of played it off. And then Keith apologised and said it was just his sense of humour that he was making. Yeah, they both laughing.
I was so relieved to hear like them both laughing and not like anything else had gone any further, or he'd not.
But I think quite quickly Keith had made this point of it being a potential setup, and then also been quite keen to progress the relationship.
Yeah.
At which point they thought that the stakes were effectively getting too high and that they couldn't carry on with this undercover operation as it was.
At this point, Keith is that serious about Liz that he is wanting to marry her. And I remember the investigators saying, well, you know, obviously Liz is not going to marry this guy. We either need to speed it up and get it over and done with, or we're going to end up having to pull her out, because there's only so much longer that she can keep this up for, when Keith is at the stage where he wants to marry her.
Yeah, because he was talking about them creating this blended family and everything.
The future, how they were going to live, the kids were going to know each other.
And obviously all of this is taking a real emotional toll on Liz.
Yeah.
So I think they just quickly realised, like you say, that they couldn't carry on the way that they had been doing. And they hadn't really got any good usable evidence at this point. He'd obviously talked a lot about his relationship with the police, but he'd kind of given nothing away in terms of Patricia. So, the police then decided that the undercover operation effectively needed to come to what Keith would see as much as possible as a natural end to the relationship between him and Liz.
I think this was quite clever how they did it, actually, because it sort of twisted it all round. And there was a phone call where Liz had rang Keith and said to him, you know, I'm not sure this is going to work, like I'm putting my kids first, didn't she? And she very much
and I don't think it was intentionally I think it was more to get Liz out of the situation than it was to get any information out of Keith. I think it was very much a get out for Liz rather than we want to find out information.
And she actually said on the phone, didn't she, what happens if, you know, we're in a relationship and then Patricia comes back? It's not fair on the children. You know, what would you do if she came back? Would you just then leave me for her, basically. And I suppose instead of doing the normal thing that you do in that situation and saying, well, if she did ever come back, I'm now with you, I love you, and I want to be with you in a relationship.
Yeah.
He then said, right, meet up with me.
Yeah, he said, she's not coming back. You don't need to worry about it. At which point Liz said, well, we can't ever know that for sure.
Why?
We don't know what's happened.
Yeah.
And he said, no, don't worry about it. Do you want me to say it? And then said, if you really need reassuring, we'll meet up tomorrow in the car. So what we're now going to come on to is the meet, effectively. And the meet was to take place the following day in Liz's car, which is where they'd had quite a lot of these previous meets.
I feel like this is also the most dangerous part for Liz as well.
Yeah.
Although she had the listening devices, she had one of them, like a handheld listening device, under the floor in her car.
Yeah.
And she had the one in her handbag as well. I
and
still
the
feel like
handbag-
it's risky.
Yeah, it is. It's really risky because they were just like nearby. They weren't even, obviously you've not got someone laid down in the back seat trying to hide.
That's there, yeah.
That's actually in the vehicle with them. She's just on her own. And what actually happened is when they were doing all the tests prior to them going out and putting them in that situation, yes, the car microphone was working, but the wire, which was actually the live feed from her handbag, failed. And they don't know why it failed, but like these things happen with technology, you can never trust it. And unfortunately, they were like, Liz, what do you want to do? Because if you go through with it, you're on your own.
Yeah, bearing in mind now, there's usually a live feed from wherever Liz is, and the police can listen in the car outside.
Yeah.
Now that line was gone, the police didn't know in real time what was happening.
So it's a bit like that conversation they had in the pub where it got a little bit dicey, but they could hear that and they were ready to pounce whenever they needed to. They've now not got this live feed, so unless they can see physically that something's happening, they've got no way of knowing.
Yeah.
But Liz was incredibly brave and said, we've come this far, we've got to go through with it.
Let's go and do it, yeah.
So they were then left in the car, and I think it was an hour or so that they were in the car alone together. Obviously, everyone's just waiting. They don't know what's gone on, what's being said. They're just waiting to be able to hear the recording afterwards. And they then saw Keith exit the car. He went and got his own car, and then he drove off. And at that point, Liz then drove off in the other direction, and further down the road, she then stopped the car and met up with, again, it was Steve Bancroft, I believe, that she met up with.
Jim
Bancroft, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm getting them confused. Steve is the other detective sergeant. And so they pulled up further down the road. Liz got out of her car. He got out of his car. And he said she was visibly upset as soon as she got out of the car.
You would be after that, though, wouldn't you?
It's a lot.
Even if you'd not got any information on the situation, I feel like it'd come to a peak, and then all of a sudden you'd be, be relieved that it was over.
And the adrenaline that you would still have from having been sat in the car with him for over an hour, and we don't know what has been said at that point. And then that decompression almost. I don't know about you, but the car for me is always, no matter what's happened, a good decompression.
Yeah.
So I feel like the minute that you get into the car on your own, she would have just felt it, really felt it. And apparently she was visibly upset, but she said, he did it, he's killed Patricia.
Yeah.
And at that point, they just needed to assess the tapes, assess the evidence as to what had actually been said. So incredibly brave of Liz. They are obviously excited as police officers now, as detectives, that they might have got
They've actually got something after all this time.
Yeah, got the information that they're looking for. Unfortunately, obviously, again, we've got to remember that this is a real victim, and that information would mean that Patricia is no longer with us and has died. But effectively, it would also mean that they can then give closure to the case.
The family.
So Keith was then rearrested. Obviously, based on this information, he was rearrested and he refused to give any information. I think it was at that point that he basically said that he was in love with Liz. They played in one of the recordings, and it was obviously the first time he realised that that relationship wasn't as he thought it was. And he then claimed that he would have told Liz anything she wanted to hear in order for them to have a future together and to stay together.
And did you notice all the way through this, he still claimed he was in love with Liz?
Yes.
You know, all the way
Yeah.
through. It wasn't like he found out she was an undercover police officer and he was like, oh, now that obviously that none of that relationship was real.
No.
He said a few times like, oh yeah, I've still got feelings.
And he
for
was
Liz.
actually held for a year on remand.
Yeah.
And he even said through that year, he obviously did a lot of thinking, but yes, he was in love with Liz.
Yeah.
And I think that played into his defence, because that did play into the fact that he said that he would have lied effectively to tell her what she wanted to hear.
Well, he said he wanted to put her mind at ease, but I just don't know who in the right mind thinking admitting to then killing your ex-wife is going to make you, what you want to be your future wife, feel any more secure
I don't
about the
always
situation.
have great taste, but if someone told me that they had killed their previous wife, I would like to think that I would think that's a no
and the
from
way
me.
that Keith said that he did it is that he strangled her and then put her into an incinerator. And there was a few rumours going around in between before this as well, that Keith was guilty of it. And the bakery that he was working at in Bradford had actually got an incinerator.
Yeah, so I think initially when he'd been first arrested, like quite a lot of the locals were saying, well, if he did it, that's
where he's put her,
got away
and
with
then
it.
You know, the strangling, we knew that he'd had previous history of strangling her, so both of those things sort of together, they had access to the incinerator, and he chose to say that he'd strangled her, is sort of like a bit, it's not really coincidental.
No,
is it?
it's not coming from nowhere.
Yeah.
Okay, so he was kept in prison for a year on remand, and then it was the 28th of February 1994 now, so 2 years later, in February, that the trial began. And at this point, there was an awful lot of potentially circumstantial evidence. Quite interesting, actually, because the one thing I was thinking about from our point of view is that there's not an awful lot of solid, what we would call trace evidence to place him there. We don't even know.
There's no body.
We've not got a body. We haven't got, I'm assuming that the house was searched.
And the car.
And the car was searched. But as far as we know, there wasn't a lot of evidence from either of those things.
Yeah.
Again, if she was strangled, blood is quite a good, determiner when we're looking at where a crime might have taken place. But if she's been strangled, there wasn't necessarily any trace of that.
Yeah.
So it is looking, other than this confession, quite shaky at the minute.
That's the only piece of evidence, really, isn't it?
Yeah, but it went to trial, and obviously the defence were arguing that all of the tapes which were recorded throughout the conversations between Liz and Keith, and this crucial piece of tape recording, which was the confession that happened within the car, shouldn't be used as evidence because it was effectively a honey trap. They were saying it was entrapment because if you are going to interview someone, which they claim is what Liz was doing, you need to be cautioned.
Yeah, she didn't read the rights. But I do feel like there is other cases where police work undercover. So if they're going to get their information, I mean, it sort of defeats the object of being undercover.
Well, exactly.
If you're going to say you've got the right to remain silent in the middle of it, you know.
Yeah. I'm your girlfriend, but can I just say that before you say anything, you do have a right to remain silent. It just wouldn't work.
Anything you do say, maybe giving in evidence.
Yeah.
So then, what were you going to say about your confession? It's not going to follow up very well, is it?
So obviously, the officers were, the detectives were really hoping that this evidence would be used because, yes, there's a lot of undercover operations that go on, like you say, and the evidence is allowed to be used. And it would defeat the object if it was, given away. But that they'd got what they needed. And effectively, if those tapes weren't used as evidence, you were letting someone guilty potentially go free.
Yeah. Yeah, so it came out, didn't it, that the tape shouldn't be used. They weren't admissible in court.
Yeah, so it was actually the jury, wasn't it, that... the judge... said that they couldn't use the tapes.
Yeah, so they weren't allowed to be played to the jury. And in this situation, maybe if they had been played to the jury, there might have been a different outcome.
Well, interestingly, the jury did actually find Keith not guilty of the murder of his wife. But the judge then made quite a controversial decision to actually let the tapes be played and just given to the public, effectively.
Yeah, let them go public, didn't they, after the
so
trial?
he let them go public, which meant that you could either read the transcripts, you still can, or listen to the clips, which we will add in, so that you can hear them for yourself to make a judgment. But a lot of the jury then did say that if they'd have heard that within the case, they would have found him guilty, which must also be heartbreaking. You'd feel so guilty that you'd let someone that has effectively murdered his wife get away with it based on this evidence that
and
you've
it's
not
disappointing
heard.
for not only the police officers but Patricia's family as well, like especially her sister, after going through all of this and not knowing what's happened and thinking finally you've got him on remand, finally we're gonna find out something solid about it, and then still to come away with nothing after it.
She even said that when they were about to read out the verdict, her husband went and reached for a hand, but she just physically couldn't have anyone touch her at that point, because that's how much it affected her, and she was just waiting. Can't even imagine. But that then meant that in the disappearance of Patricia Hall, although we had a confession from her husband Keith, he was then released and found not guilty of her murder. We then have evidence of the confession, and within those tapes he said, "Do you want me to say it out loud, Liz? That person's never going to come back." He didn't even mention Patricia by name.
Yeah.
He said that person's never going to come back. And he said 8 words, which have become really significant.
Oh, yeah, this gave me chills when I read this.
He said, "I strangled her, but it wasn't that easy." And I think for someone to even say that, I mean, he claims that he said, he was lying to get Liz on side. That's a very specific, dark lie. To say how you killed someone, how you killed your wife,
how you got into the body as well,
specified, just seems really, really difficult.
So if you do watch the confessions, it's
on Amazon Prime.
I think it's 2 or 3 part, maybe?
Yeah, 2 parts on Amazon Prime. It's called The Confession, The Disappearance of Patricia Ann Hall. And it is centred around interviews between Christine Weatherhead, I think,
Weatherhead,
is her sister's full name, and Keith himself.
So Keith is actually talking on there, giving things from his perspective.
Keith continues to quite happily talk to the press, the police.
TV. He's done a lot of TV interviews with Rodney Lester as well, his solicitor. He did a few TV shows with him,
the limelight
didn't he?
as well, it seems, doesn't he?
Yeah.
But I think that's something that we should definitely mention, this kind of relationship that he has with the press and the police. Because one thing that we haven't mentioned, and that if you watch the confession, you will see, there was actually a local journalist called Sharon Boyle.
Yep.
And Sharon was obviously interested in this case. It was a local case for her.
She said it took up almost of her working career, this case. So that's extraordinary, isn't it, that it took that long?
And she would ring Keith on a weekly basis. And she says that she found that he seemed quite lonely because he would always answer these calls, and she would ask how he is, ask how his week's going, ask how the boys were getting on. And then she said that at the end of these phone calls, she started saying, "Keith, did you kill Patricia?"
Oh, yeah, she was asking him directly, wasn't she?
Yeah, she was just asking him on a weekly basis whether or not he'd killed his own wife. And she said that he would entertain this conversation weekly. And there was only once, I think, that she says that he kind of flipped.
Yes,
and
he did,
she asked the same question as she had done many times before, but he then flipped and didn't answer her calls then.
Yeah.
But his relationship with Sharon is interesting because it seems odd that you would constantly put yourself in that position or entertain someone like that. Generally, when we see victims of a missing person case or a murder case, they get absolutely sick of the press, and the only reason that they are really communicating with the press is to try and raise
awareness and
raise
find
awareness.
their loved one.
Like Christine, she says she doesn't want to do any of these interviews, but if it helps find out something about her sister and what's happened to her, then of course she's going to do it. So I think it's really interesting that he seems to just do it off his own bat almost, and revels in it. And I think one of the key things for me that I thought was really odd, I think for me it's the pulling the solicitor's name out of his back pocket, and then it's the fact that the first year after her disappearance, he actually sent the police a Christmas card.
Oh, I saw the Christmas card. I thought that is very, very strange to do something like that. And it said to I don't know if it was to Jim, but it said all the team
and all the team at
Pudsey. Merry Christmas, and he put in it from Keith Hall, didn't they? They knew exactly who it was.
Just odd. No, like, thank you for never giving up on my wife, or thank you for all the work that you've put
Again,
in.
it was sarcastic.
It was as if it was smug and intentional, and like he's playing a game, which he has said, as I've mentioned, he said he's in a psychological battle with the police. Yeah. Which is an odd position to have when you've got a missing wife.
It is, definitely. So, shall we finish off on there?
Well, we'll finish off with what you think, Annie. Do you think that Patricia is still alive?
No. My personal opinion is that Keith will have done something to her. Where she is another story, because you would have thought if he'd transported her somewhere, if he'd done something to her in the house and transported her somewhere in the car, there would be evidence in the car, there would be blood. So I don't know how he's done it, and I couldn't tell you any more information, but I do think that Keith was very suspicious the whole way through the whole investigation.
I agree. I think it's tricky for us because like we say, there's not a lot of tangible evidence, and evidence is what we have to go on in a case like this. But there are just a number of things, a number of suspicious circumstance. We've got the history of their relationship, and I agree with you that unfortunately, I think it seems very unlikely that Patricia is alive today.
Yeah.
It's important to note that the children, Andrew and Graham, are still being raised by Keith. Keith, I believe, still lives in the same family home in Pudsey. He says he is refusing to leave, even though the neighbourhood believes that he killed his wife, because he shouldn't be pushed out of his home.
Right.
But that he's still raising his children. However, he won't let them have anything to do with their auntie. So Christine's has nothing.
Missed out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's just a tragic case all round, really. And I don't think, hopefully, with, as we mentioned, scientific advancements, maybe we will finally get an answer. But it doesn't look like at this moment in time there will be for potentially some years to come.
Yeah, unfortunately. So we hope you've enjoyed listening to our first case study. Well, I say enjoyed. It's not really an enjoyable. It's difficult. It is difficult to find the balance, obviously, when you find these things interesting. But we have got the case number for this, which we are going to put in the show notes.
So if you have any information at all, make sure that you do let them know.
So if you are watching us on YouTube, please make sure you like the video, you subscribe to our channel, and you follow us on all our other social media. We've got Instagram, we've got TikTok. And if you are listening to the audio version, so if you're listening to the podcast on Apple or Spotify, please leave us a review and leave us a comment with what you thought of our first episode. So I think that's everything for today.
Yeah.
And we will see you next week.
Take care.